The Girl Next Door by Augusta Seaman. Recording by Jennifer Dallman. Chapter 1. Marcia's Secret. Marcia Brett, do you mean to tell me— Tell you what? That you have had a secret for 2 whole months and never told me about it, and I am your best friend? I was waiting until you came to the city, Janet. I wanted to tell you. I didn't want to write it. Well, I have been in the city for 12 hours, and you never said a word about it until just now. But, Janet, we've been sightseeing ever since you arrived. You can't very well tell secrets when you're sightseeing, you know. Well, you might have given me a hint about it long ago. You know we've solemnly promised never to have any secrets from each other, and yet you've had one for 2 whole months. No, Janet, I haven't had it quite as long as that, honest. It didn't begin until quite after I came. In fact, not until about 3 or 4 weeks ago. Tell me all about it right away, then, and perhaps I'll forgive you. The 2 girls cuddled up close to each other on the low couch by the open window, and lowered their voices to a whisper. Through the warm darkness of the June night came the hum of the great city, a subdued, murmurous sound, strangely unfamiliar to one of the girls, who was in the city for the first time in all of her country life. To the other, the sound had some time since become an accustomed one. As they leaned their elbows on the sill and, chins in hand, stared out into the darkness, Marcia began. Well, Jan, I might as well commence at the beginning, so you'll understand how it all happened. I've been just crazy to tell you, but I am not good at letter writing, and there is such a lot to explain that I thought I'd wait till your visit. You know, when we first moved to this apartment last April, from way back in Northam, I was all excitement for a while, just to be living in the city. Everything was so different. Really, I acted so silly, you wouldn't believe it. I used to run down to the front door 6 times a day, just to push the bell to see the door open all by itself. It seemed like something in a fairy tale. For the longest while, I couldn't get used to the dumbwaiter, or the steam heat, or the electric lights, and all of that sort of thing. It is awfully different from our old-fashioned little Northam, now isn't it? Yes, I feel just that way this minute, admitted Janet. And then, too, went on Marcia, there were all the things outside to do and see, the trolleys and stores and parks and museums and the zoo. Aunt Minerva said I went around like a distracted chicken for a while. And besides that, we used to have the greatest fun shopping for new furniture and things for this apartment. Hardly a bit of that big old furniture we brought with us would fit into it. These rooms are so much smaller than the ones in our old farmhouse. Well, anyhow, for a while I was too busy and interested and excited to think of another thing. Yes, too busy to even write to me, interrupted Janet. I had about 1 letter in 2 weeks from you those days, and you promised to write every other day. Oh, well, never mind that now. You'd have done the same, I guess. If you don't let me go on, I'll never get to the secret. After a while, though, I got used to all the new things, and I had seen the sights, and Aunt Minerva had finished all of the furnishings except the curtains and draperies. She's at that yet, and all of a sudden everything fell flat. I hadn't begun my music lessons, and there didn't seem to be a thing to do or a single interest in life. The truth is, Janet, I was frightfully lonesome for you. Here Marcia felt her hand squeezed in the darkness. Perhaps you don't realize it, but living in an apartment in a big city is the queerest thing. You don't know your neighbor that lives right across the hall. You don't know a soul in the house. And, as far as I can see, you're not likely to if you lived here 50 years. Nobody calls on you as they do a new family in the country. Nobody seems to care a rap who you are, and whether you live or die, or anything. And wouldn't you believe it, Janet, there isn't another girl in this whole apartment, either older or younger than myself, no one but grown-ups. So you can see how awfully lonesome I've been. And as Aunt Minerva had decided not to send me to high school till fall, I didn't have a chance to get acquainted with anyone my own age. Actually, it got so I didn't do much else but moon around and mark off the days till the school in Northam closed and you could come. And oh, I'm so glad that you're here for the summer. Isn't it gorgeous?" She hugged her chum spasmodically. "But to go on, I'm telling you this so you can see what led up to my doing what I did about the secret. It began one awfully rainy afternoon last month. I had been for a walk in the wet, just for exercise, and when I came in, Aunt Minerva was out shopping. I hadn't a new book to read nor a blessed thing to do, so I just sat down right here by the window and got to thinking and wondering why things were so unevenly divided. Why you, Jan, should have a mother and a father and a big, jolly lot of brothers and sisters, and I should be just one, all alone, living with Aunt Minerva, though she's lovely to me, with no mother, and a father away nearly all the time on his ship. And it seemed as if I just hated this apartment with its little rooms like cubbyholes all in a row. I longed to be back in Northam, and I even thought I'd give anything to live in that big, rambling, dingy old place next door, beyond the brick wall. For at least one could go up and down stairs to different rooms. Then, if you believe me, Jan, as I stared at the house, it began to dawn on me that I'd never really taken it in before, that it was a very strange-looking old place. And because I didn't have another mortal thing to do, I just sat and stared at it as if I had never seen it before, and began to wonder and wonder about it, for there were a number of things about it that seemed decidedly queer. "What's it like, anyway?" questioned Janet. "There were so many other things to see today that I didn't notice it at all, and it's so dark now I can't see a thing." "Why, it's a big, square, 4-story brick house, and it's terribly in need of paint. It looks like it hasn't had a coat in years and years. It stands way back from the street, in a sort of ragged, weedy garden, and there's a high brick wall around the whole place, except for the heavy wooden gate at the front covered with ironwork. That gate is always closed. The stone walk runs from the gate to the front door. Way back around the rear of the garden is an old brick stable that looks as if it hadn't been opened or used in years. You'll see all of this for yourself, Janet, when you look out the window in the morning, for this apartment house runs along close to the brick wall, and as we're 3 floors up, you'll get a good view of the whole place. This window in my room is the very best place of all to see it, fortunately. But the queer thing about it is that, though the shutters are tightly closed or bowed, every one, and the whole place looks deserted, it really isn't. There's someone living in it, and once in a while you happen to see signs of it. For instance, that very afternoon I saw this. Most of the shutters were tightly closed, but on the second floor they are usually just bowed, and that day the slats of one of them were open, and I thought I could see a muslin curtain flapping behind it. But while I was looking, the fingers of a hand suddenly appeared between the slats and snapped them shut with a jerk. Of course, there's nothing so awfully strange about a thing like that as a rule, but somehow the way it was done seemed mysterious. I can't explain just why. Anyhow, as I hadn't a thing else to do, I concluded I'd sit there for a while longer and see if something would happen. But nothing did, not for nearly an hour, and I was getting tired of the thing and just going to get up and go away when— "What?" breathed Janet in an excited whisper. The big front door opened. It was nearly dark by that time, and out crept the queerest little figure. It appeared to be a little old woman, all dressed in dingy black clothes that looked as though they must have come out of the Ark, they were so old-fashioned. Her hat was a queer little bonnet, with no trimming except a heavy black veil that came down over her face. She had a small market-basket on her arm and a big old umbrella. But the queerest thing was the way she scuttled down the path to the gate, like a frightened rabbit, turning her head side to side, as if she was afraid of being seen or watched. When she got to the gate, she had to put down the basket and the umbrella and use both hands to unlock it with a huge key. When she got outside of it, on the street, she shut the gate behind her, and of course I couldn't see her any more. Well, it set me to wondering and wondering what the story of that queer old house and queer old lady could be. It seemed as if there must be some sort of story about it, or some explanation, for you see, it's a big place, and evidently at one time must have been very handsome, and it stands right here in one of the busiest and most valuable parts of the city. The more I thought about it, the more curious I grew. But the worst of it was that I didn't know a soul who could tell me the least thing about it. Aunt Minerva couldn't, of course, and I wasn't acquainted with another person in the city. It just seemed as if I must find some explanation. Then, all of a sudden, I thought of our new colored maid. Perhaps she might have heard something about it. I made up my mind to go right out to the kitchen. So I went and started her talking about things in general, and finally asked her if she knew anything about the old house. And then I wish you could have heard her. I can't tell it all the way she did, but this is the substance of it. It seems that she discovered that the janitor here is the son of an old friend from North Carolina. Of course, she's been talking to him a lot, and he has told her all about the whole neighborhood, especially about the queer old house next door. He says it is known all around here as Benedict's Folly. "Why?" queried Janet. "Well, years and years ago, when the owner built it, his name was Benedict. It was way out of the city limits, and everybody thought he was awfully foolish going so far and building a handsome city house off in the wilderness. But he wasn't so foolish after all, for the city came right up and surrounded him in the end, and the property is worth no end of money now. But here's the queer thing about it. Old Mr. Benedict's been dead many years, and the place looks as if no one lived there, but someone does. It's the daughter of his, a queer little old lady who keeps herself shut up there all the time. Some think she's alone, others say no, and some one else is there with her. No one seems to know definitely. Anyhow, although she is very wealthy, she does all the work herself and the marketing, and she even carries home all the things and won't allow a single one of the tradesmen to come in. Mr. Simmons, that's our janitor, says that 2 years ago in the winter a water pipe there burst, and Miss Benedict just had to get a plumber. And he afterward told awfully peculiar things about the way the house looked. The furniture all draped and covered up, and even the pictures on the wall covered too, and not a single modern improvement except the running water and some old-fashioned gas fixtures. And the little old lady never raised her veil while he was there, so he couldn't see what she looked like. Mr. Simmons says that everyone thinks that there is some great mystery about Benedict's Folly, but no one seems to be able to guess what it can be. Now, Janet, isn't that just fascinating? Think of living next door to a mystery!" "It's simply thrilling," sighed Janet. "But, Marcia, I don't see what this has to do with a secret. Where do you come in? I don't see why you couldn't have written all of this to me." "Wait," said Marcia. "I haven't finished yet. That was absolutely all that I could get out of our maid Eliza. All she or anyone else knew, in fact. But as you can imagine, I couldn't get the thing out of my mind, and I couldn't stop looking at the place either. I tried to talk to Aunt Minerva about it. She wasn't a bit interested. She said she couldn't understand how anyone could keep a house in that slovenly fashion, and that's all she would say. So I gave up trying to interest her. Now I must tell you the odd thing that happened that very night. You know I've said it was raining hard all that day, and by 10 o'clock the wind was blowing a gale. I was just ready for bed and had turned off my light and raised the shade, when I thought I'd take another peep at my mysterious mansion across the fence. All I could see, however, were just some streaks of light through the chinks in the shutters in the one room on the second floor. All of the rest of the place was as dark as a pocket. And as I sat staring out, it suddenly came to me what fun it would be to try to unravel the whole mysterious affair all by myself. It would certainly help me pass the dull days till you came. But then, too, the only way I could do it would be to watch this old place like a cat, and I knew that wouldn't be right. It would be too much like spying on your neighbor's affairs, and of course that's horrid. Finally, I concluded that I could do it without being meddlesome or prying. I'd just watch the place a little and see if anything interesting would happen. And while I was thinking this, a strange thing did happen that very minute. The wind had grown terrific, and all of a sudden it just took one of the shutters in that lighted room and ripped it from its fastening, and it threw it back against the wall. And the next moment a figure hurried to the window, leaned out, and drew the shutter back in place again. But just for one instant I had caught a glimpse of the whole inside of the room. And what do you suppose I saw, Jan?" "What?" demanded Janet. Well, not much of the furnishings except a lighted oil lamp on the table, but directly in the center of the room, in a perfectly enormous armchair, sat a woman. And it wasn't the one that I had seen in the afternoon either. I'm sure of that. I couldn't see her face, for it was in shadow, but she was looking down at something spread out on her lap, and she held her right hand over it in the air and waved it back and forth, sort of uncertainly. You can't imagine what a strange picture it was. And then the shutter was closed. There was just something so weird about it. If I was curious before, I was simply wild with interest then. It seemed as if I must know what it all meant. What that strange old lady could be doing, sitting there in state in the middle of the room, and all the rest of it. You don't blame me, do you, Jan? Indeed I don't. I'd be 10 times worse, I guess. But what about the secret? And did you find out anything else? Yes, I did. And that's the secret. The whole mysterious thing is the secret, because no one but you knows that I am the least interested in the affair, and I don't want them to. Now, I'll tell you what happened next. But just at this moment the girls were interrupted by a knock at their door and a voice inquiring, "Girls, girls, haven't you gone to bed yet? I heard you talking for the last hour." "No, Aunt Minerva," answered Marcia. "We're sitting by the window." "Well, you must go to bed at once. It's nearly midnight. You won't either of you be fit for a thing tomorrow. Now mind, not another word. Good night." "Good night," they both answered, but heaved a sigh when Aunt Minerva was out of hearing. "It's no use," whispered Marcia. "We'll have to stop for tonight. But there's a lot more, and the most interesting part of it, too. Well, never mind. I'll tell you all the rest tomorrow." End of Chapter 1. Marcia's Secret. Chapter 2. The Face Behind the Shutter. Janet had no sooner hopped out of bed the next morning than she flew to the window to examine Benedict's Folly by broad daylight. In the streaming sun of a June morning, the dingy old mansion certainly bore out the truth of Marcia's mysterious description. "Gracious! I should think that you would have been interested in it from the first," she exclaimed. "Interested in what?" yawned Marcia, sleepily opening her eyes. "Benedict's Folly, of course. Let's see," went on Janet, who possessed a very practical, orderly mind. "From your story last night it seems that there must be 2 people living there. But look here, how did you know, Marcia, that it was another old lady that you saw that night when the shutter blew open?" "Why, for several reasons," answered Marcia. "In the first place, the one who goes out is short and slight. The one sitting in the chair is evidently large and rather stout, and different somehow, although I didn't see either of their faces. And then it wasn't the lady in the chair who closed the shutter. She evidently never moved. So it must have been someone else." "Yes, it must have been," agreed Janet, convinced. "Queer that nobody seems to know about the second one. I wonder who she is. And are there any more? Go on with your story, Marcia." "No," said Marcia. "Wait till we can be by ourselves for a long while. I don't want to be interrupted. Aunt Minerva's going out this morning, and then we'll have a chance." So later in the morning the 2 girls sat by Marcia's window, each occupied with a dainty bit of embroidery, and Marcia began anew. "Well, after that rainy night for several days I didn't see a thing more that was interesting about the old house or the queer people who lived in it. I used to watch once in a while to see if the little old lady in black would go out again in the afternoon, as she did before, but she didn't. Then a day or 2 later I did something that surprised even myself, for I hadn't the faintest intention of doing it. I had been taking a walk that afternoon, and I was just coming home, passing on the way the high brick wall of the Benedict house. It was just as I reached the closed gate that an idea popped into my head. You know they say that no visitors are ever admitted, and no rings or knocks at the gate are ever answered. Well, something suddenly prompted me to ring that bell and see what would happen. I never stopped to ask myself what I should say if someone came and inquired what I wanted. I just rang it suddenly, and I had to pull hard, the old thing was so rusty. and far away, somewhere in the house, I heard a faint tinkle. Then I got kind of panic-stricken, wondering what I'd say if anyone really did come. But I needn't have worried, for what do you suppose happened? Nothing, answered Janet promptly. That's just where you're mistaken, but you'd never guess what it was. About a minute after I rung the bell, I heard light footsteps on the walk behind the gate. But instead of coming toward the gate, they were hurrying away from it. And in another minute I heard the front door close. After that, all was quiet and nothing else happened. Then I went on home. I know, interrupted Janet, whose quick mind had already worked out the problem, exactly what occurred. It was Miss Benedict, who had just been about to come out on her way to do the marketing, and your ring frightened her and sent her hurrying back into the house. Isn't it all singular? Yes, it must have been, agreed Marcia, and it made me more curious than ever to understand about it. And I was so annoyed at myself for ringing at all. If I hadn't, I might have seen Miss Benedict close by when she came out of the gate. It serves me right for doing such a thing anyhow. But after that I got to watching every time I went out, thinking that I might see her on the street somewhere, especially if it was about the time that she usually did her marketing, along towards dusk. Several days passed, however, and I never did. I had a thought of watching from my window to see when she went out and then following her, but that didn't seem right somehow. It would be too much like spying on her, so I just concluded that I'd trust to chance. And luck favored me at last, one morning, about a week after I had rung her bell. It happened that night before. Eliza suddenly discovered that we were all out of oatmeal for breakfast, and I promised her I'd get some very early in the morning when I went to take my walk. You know, I have found that on these warm summer days in the city it is much pleasanter to take a walk in the real early morning than to wait till later in the day, when it is hot and crowded. And I always used to love walking in the early morning up in Northam. Well, anyhow, I got up that day about 6. I knew that no stores near here would be open so early, and I decided to walk over towards the other side of town. It's sort of a poor section there, and the stores often open up quite early so that folks can do their marketing before they go to work. It was a beautiful, cool morning, and I was quite enjoying myself when, Jan, what do you think? I looked up, and about a half a block ahead of me was a little black figure with a market basket, hurrying along. I knew it was Miss Benedict. Can you imagine my surprise and delight? I suddenly made up my mind to keep behind her and go into the same store she did. There could surely be no harm in that. And by I saw her turn into a little grocery shop. A minute or two after, and I went to the counter and stood right near her. There was no one in the store besides ourselves and the grocer. He looked sleepy and was yawning while he wrapped up something for her. He asked me to wait a minute, please, which of course I was only too delighted to do, for it gave me perfect right to stand close to my mysterious little neighbor and hear her speak. And it was right there, Janet, that I got the surprise of my life. She still wore her black veil, and it was so thick that not a bit of her face could be seen. Her dress was the most old-fashioned thing. It looked 20 years old, if not more. But I don't know what sort of voice I expected to hear. But it was nothing in the least of what I did hear. I can't exactly describe it to you, Jan, but it was the most beautiful speaking voice I have ever heard in my life. It was soft and flute-like, and oh, so appealing. It somehow went straight to my heart. It made me feel as if I wanted to take care of Miss Benedict somehow. I can't exactly explain it. Even when she was speaking of such commonplace things as butter and eggs and sugar, it was like music. Well, in a few minutes she had finished, and the grocer packed her things in her basket, and away she went. I had to stay, of course, and get my oatmeal, and I didn't see her again. But being so close to her and hearing that lovely voice had changed my whole feeling about her. At first, I had just been interested and awfully curious about the whole mysterious affair, and I'll confess just a wee bit repelled by the account of the queer little lady and the strange way she lived. I wanted to know the explanation of the mystery, but I didn't particularly want to know her. But after that I felt different, sort of bewitched by that beautiful voice. I wanted to help that Miss Benedict. I wanted to do something for her, or to try to make her happier, or something. I couldn't quite explain what. And I wanted, oh, so much, to see her face, and to know what she was like, and more about herself. Can you understand, Jan?" "Indeed I can. But do go on. Did you ever meet her again?" "No, I didn't. But I've seen and heard something else that's strange, more strange than all the rest." "Tell me quick," demanded Janet. "2 nights ago I sat here by the window. It was too hot to turn on the light, but it was very dark outside. Presently I heard footsteps in the Benedict garden. They were light, quick footsteps, and sounded exactly as if someone were running about, or skipping and jumping. First I thought it must be a big dog, for it couldn't possibly have been either one of those 2 old ladies running and skipping that way. And then I heard a soft humming, as if someone were singing a tune half under the breath. And then, very soon after, a door opened, and a voice called out very softly, 'Come in now.' And after that all was quiet. Now, Janet McNeil, I am simply positive that there is some one else in that house beside the 2 old ladies, some one who hasn't been seen yet. What do you make of it?" "You must be right," replied Janet thoughtfully. "It couldn't be either of them running about in the garden in the dark and humming a tune. It isn't at all what they'd likely to do. I think that it must be someone else, more human and natural somehow, and younger too. But what on earth do they all keep so shut up for, and act as if they were afraid to be seen? It's the queerest thing I've ever heard of. You certainly have moved next door to a dark brown mystery, Marcia." For the ensuing hour the girls embroidered steadily and discussed Benedict's Folly and its inmates in all their peculiar phases. But turn and twist it as they might, they could find no answer to the riddle. After a while Janet changed the subject. "By the way, Marcia, how are you coming on with your violin practice? Have you begun taking lessons here yet? You know that was one of the principal things you folks moved to the city for, so that you could study with the best teachers." "Yes, I've begun with Professor Hardwick," said Marcia. "I've practiced quite hard lately. It's about all I've had to do. He says I've made some progress already." "Oh, do get your violin and play some for me," begged Janet. "I am starving for some good music. I haven't heard any since you left Northam." So Marcia obligingly went to the parlor and brought back her violin. When she had tuned it and tucked it lovingly under her chin, she sat down at the window seat and ran her bow over the strings in a shower of liquid melody. For one so young she played astonishingly well. Janet listened, breathless, absorbed. "Marcia, dear, you have improved!" she exclaimed as her chum stopped for a moment. "Now do play my favorite." Marcia laid her bow on the strings once more and slipped into a tender reverie of the Träumerei. But before it was finished, Janet, wide-eyed with astonishment, laid her hand on Marcia's arm. "Look!" she breathed. Marcia followed the direction of her gaze and turned to stare out the window at the house opposite. And this is what she saw. The shutter of the window on the top floor had been pushed partially open, and a face looked out, a face with big, appealing eyes, and a frame of golden, curling hair falling all about it. Straight over at the 2 in the window it gazed, eager, absorbed, delighted. And then suddenly, as it detected their own interested stare, it withdrew, and the shutter was softly closed. The 2 girls drew a long breath and gazed at each other. "Janet, what did I tell you? There is someone else in that house," cried Marcia. "I guess you're right," admitted Janet, quieter, but no less excited. "But do you realize who that 3rd person is, Marcia Brett? It isn't an old lady. It is someone just about our own age. It's a young girl." End of Chapter 2. The Face Behind the Shutter. Chapter 3. The Gate Opens. For the 2 ensuing days, Marcia and Janet, tense with excitement, discussed the most recently discovered inmate of Benedict's Folly, and watched incessantly for another glimpse of the face behind the shutter. How was it, they constantly demanded of each other, that a girl of 14 or 15 had come to be shut up in that dreary old place? Was she a prisoner there? Was she a relative, friend, or servant? Was she free to come and go? To the latter question they unanimously voted no. How could she be aught else but a prisoner when she was never seen going in or out, was forced to take her exercise after nightfall in the dark garden, and was kept constantly behind closed shutters? No girl of that age in her right mind could deliberately choose a life like that. "Do you suppose that she has always lived there?" queried Marcia for the 20th time. And as Janet could answer it no better than herself, she propounded another question. "And why do you suppose she opened the shutter and looked out, seeming so delighted when I played, and then drew in so quickly when we noticed her? Is she afraid of being seen too?" "Evidently," said Janet. "She must be as full of mystery as the rest of them. And yet I can't somehow feel that she is like them. She's so sweet and young and oh, you know what I mean." Of course she knew, but it didn't help them in the least to solve this latest phase of their mystery. Finally, Marcia, who still clung a bit shyly to the fairy lore of her earlier years, declared, "I believe she's a regular Cinderella, kept there to do all the hard work of the place by those two queer old ladies, and I shouldn't be a bit surprised if she is down in the kitchen this minute, cleaning out the ashes of the stove. Come, Jan, let's go for a walk, and when we come back I'll play the violin by the window. Maybe our little Cinderella will peep out again." The two girls put on their hats and strolled out for their usual afternoon walk and treat of ice cream soda. But they had gone no further from their own door than the length of the Benedict brick wall when they were suddenly brought to a halt in front of the closed gate by hearing a sound on the other side of it. It was a sound indicative of someone's struggling attempt to open it. The click of the key turning and turning in the lock, and the futile rattling of the iron knob, and then the sound of a voice murmuring, "Oh, dear, what shall I do? I can't get this open." "Janet," whispered Marcia, "that's not the voice of Miss Benedict. I know it. I believe it's Cinderella, and she's trying to run away. What shall we do? Stay here?" "No," Janet whispered back. "Let's just stroll on a little way, and then turn back. We can see what happens then without seeming to be watching." They walked on quietly for a number of yards, and then turned to approach the gate again. Even as they did so, they saw it open, and out stepped a little figure. It was not Miss Benedict. The slim, trim, little girlish form was clad in plain dark clothes of a slightly unfamiliar cut, but the face was the one that had appeared in the upper window, and the thick golden curls were surmounted by a black velvet tam o' shanter. On her arm she carried a small market basket, and her eyes had a bewildered, almost frightened look. In their excited interest, Marcia and Janet had quite unconsciously stopped short of where they were and waited to see which way their Cinderella would turn. But though they stood for an appreciable moment, she turned neither way, and only stood, her back to the gate, gazing uncertainly to the right and left. And then, perceiving them, she seemed to take a sudden resolution and turned to them appealingly. "Oh, please, could you direct me how to find this?" she asked, holding out a slip of paper. Marcia hurried to her side and read the written address. And when she had read it, she realized it was the little grocery shop on the other side of town where she had once encountered Miss Benedict. "Why, certainly," she cried. "You walk over 5 blocks in that direction, then you turn to your left and down 3. You can't miss it. It's right next to the shoemaker's place." The child looked more bewildered than ever, and her eyes strayed to the busy street crossing near which they stood, crowded with hurrying trucks and automobiles. "Thank you," she faltered. "Do I go this way?" And then, with sudden candor, "You see, I'm strange in these streets." Her voice was pretty and clear, but her accent markedly un-American. Both girls half consciously noted it. "See here," said Marcia, "would you care to have us take you there? We're not going in any special direction, and I've been there before." An infinitely relieved expression came over the girl's face. "Oh, would you be so kind? I'm just scared to death on these streets." They turned to accompany her, one on each side, and piloted her safely across the busy avenue. Then, in the quiet stretch of the next block, they proceeded together in complete and embarrassing silence. It was a silence that Marcia and Janet had fully expected their companion to break, possibly to reveal some reason for her errand and her strangeness in the streets. They themselves hesitated to say much, for fear of seeming curious or anxious to force her confidence, but she said not a word. The strain at last became too much for Janet. "I don't blame you for feeling nervous in these city streets," she began. "I'm a country girl myself, and I act like a scared rabbit whenever I go out alone here." The girl turned to her with a little confiding gesture. "I've never been out on them alone before," she said. Then there was another silence, during which Marcia and Janet both searched frantically in their minds for something else to say. But it was the girl herself who broke the silence the second time. "Thank you for your music the other day," she said, turning to Marcia. "I heard you. I often hear you and listen." "Oh, I'm so glad you liked it!" cried Marcia. "Do you care for music?" "I adore it," she said simply. "Look here!" exclaimed Marcia suddenly. "How did you know that it was I that played the violin?" "Because I've watched you often, through the slats." Marcia and Janet exchanged glances. So the watching was not all on their side of the fence. Here was a revelation. "The last thing you played the other day, will you tell me what it was?" went on their new companion shyly. "Why, it was Schumann's Träumerei," answered Marcia. "I love it, don't you?" "Yes, but I never heard it before. That is, I never remember hearing it. And yet, somehow, I seem to know it. I can't think why. I don't understand. It was as if I'd dreamed it, I think." Marcia and Janet again exchanged glances. What a strange child this was, who talked of having dreamed music that was quite familiar to almost everyone. "Perhaps you heard it at a concert," suggested Janet. "I never went to a concert," she replied, much to their amazement. And then, perceiving their surprise, she added, "You see, I've always lived way off in the country, in just a little village, till now." "Oh, yes," answered Janet, pretending enlightenment, though in truth she and Marcia were more bewildered than ever. By this time they had reached the little grocery shop, and all proceeded inside while their new friend made her purchases. These she read off slowly from a slip of paper, and the grocer packed them in her basket. But when it came to paying for them and making change, she became entangled in a fresh puzzle. "I think you said these eggs were a shilling?" she ventured to the grocer. "Shilling? No! I said they were a quarter," he retorted impatiently. "A quarter?" she queried, and then turned questioning eyes to her two friends. "He means this," said Marcia, picking up the 25-cent piece from the change that the girl held. "Oh, thank you. I don't understand this American money," she explained, and Marcia and Janet added another query to their rapidly growing mental list. On the way back home, however, she grew silent again, and though the girls chatted back and forth about quite impersonal matters, the crowded streets, the warm weather, the sights they passed, she was not to be drawn into the conversation. And nearer they drew to their destination, the more depressed she appeared to become. At last they reached the gate. "Shall you be going out again to-morrow?" ventured Marcia. "If so, we'll go with you, if you care to have us, till you get used to the streets." The girl gave a sudden pleased glance. I don't know," she said. "You see, Miss Benedict hurt her ankle a day or two ago, and she can't get around much, so I'm doing this for her. If she wants me to go to-morrow, I will. I'd be so glad to go with you. How shall I let you know?" "Just hang a white handkerchief to your shutter before you go, and we'll see it. We'll watch for it," cried Marcia, inventing the signal on the spur of the moment. And then impetuously she added, "My name is Marcia Brett, and this is Janet McNeil. Won't you tell us yours, if we're to be friends?" "I'm Cecily Marlowe," she answered, "and I am so glad to know you." As she spoke she was fumbling with the big key in the lock of the gate. As the latter swung open she turned once more to face them, with a little pent-up sob. "I don't know why I'm here, and I'm so lonely." Then, frightened for having revealed so much, she turned quickly away and shut the gate. As they listened to her footsteps retreating up the path and the closing of the front door, Marcia and Janet turned to each other, 1,000 questions burning on their tongues. But all they could exclaim in one breath was, "Did you ever?" End of Chapter 3. The Gate Opens. Chapter 4. The Backwards Glance. The next 24 hours were spent in delightful speculation. So her name was Cecily Marlowe! Was she any relation of Miss Benedict? Marlowe and Benedict were certainly dissimilar enough. Then she might be a relation on Miss Benedict's mother's side, suggested Marcia. Does it sound likely when you think of what she said just at the last, that she didn't know why she was there? Replied Janet scornfully. She couldn't be in doubt about it if she were a relation, either come on a visit or there to stay, which argument settled that question. But where do you suppose she has come from? Marveled Marcia. She said that she has always lived in a little country village, and she didn't know a thing about American money. She's foreign, that's certain. Even her clothes and the way of speaking show it. But from where? Did you notice that she said shilling? Suggested Janet. That shows that she must be English. She looks English. Now, will you tell me how she got way over here from England and not know why she had come? It sounds as if she might have been kidnapped, said Marcia. Why, Janet, this is precisely like a mystery in a book. Do you realize it? And here we are living right next door to it. It's too good to be true. Janet's mind had, however, gone off on another tack. I can't understand that remark she made about the music. Träumerei is certainly about as well known as any piece of classic music. She said she never remembered hearing it, and yet it seemed somehow familiar to her. Can you make anything out of that? Marcia couldn't. Maybe it's all just a notion, she said helplessly. Suppose I play some on the violin here in our window right now. She seems to enjoy it so. Maybe she'll open her shutter again. So they sat on the window seat, and Marcia played her very best, including the Träumerei. But no golden head appeared from behind the shutter that afternoon. Never mind, said Janet. We'll see her tomorrow, most likely. Perhaps she's busy downstairs now. But isn't she the prettiest little thing? Mused Marcia reminiscently. The loveliest big blue eyes and curly golden hair, and such a trusting look on her face, somehow. It went right down to the very bottom of my heart, if it doesn't sound silly to put it that way. Yes, I know, agreed Janet. I felt the same way. But doesn't it strike you queer that— Oh, the whole thing's queer, interrupted Marcia. The queerest I've ever heard of. I guess you agree with me now, Janet, that I had a secret worth talking about in Benedict's Folly. But let's wait till tomorrow and see what happens. The morrow came and went, however, and nothing happened at all. Hour after hour, the two girls watched for the signal of the white handkerchief, but every shuttered window of the old mansion remained blank. Neither did anyone go in or out of the gate. Late in the afternoon, Marcia played again at the window, but the sweetest music called forth not a single sign from behind the walls of the house next door. Janet had but one solution to offer. They probably didn't need any marketing done today, so she naturally didn't go out. But why couldn't she at least looked out a moment from her window? Cried Marcia disconsolately. Surely that would have been easy to do. When she said she cared so much for the music, she must have known I was playing just for her. She may have been somewhere else in the house where she couldn't. I can't tell you, and oughtn't to blame her without knowing, declared Janet, defending the conduct of the mysterious Cecily. Tomorrow we shall see her again, no doubt. On the morrow her prophecy was fulfilled. They did see her again, but under circumstances so peculiar that they were quite dumbfounded. All morning they watched and waited in vain for some signal from the upper window, but none came, and the main part of the afternoon passed away in precisely the same way. They sat very conspicuously in their own window seat, so that there could be no doubt in Cecily's mind about their being home. Marcia even did a little violin practice while they waited, and still there was no sign. Suddenly, about 5 o'clock, Janet clutched at her chum's arm. "Look!" she cried. Marcia looked, and down the path from the front door of the strange house she saw Cecily, dressed to go out, approaching the gate. It was plain that she was bound for another marketing expedition, for the basket hung from her arm. "Well, what do you make of that?" exclaimed Marcia in bewilderment. "Did she signal to us?" "No, she didn't," returned Janet. "I've watched every minute. She couldn't have forgotten about it. But do you know, there may be some very good reason why she didn't, or couldn't. Perhaps she's hoping we will see her, and be on hand outside anyway, as we promised." "But she must have seen us sitting at the window," argued Marcia. "She might have at least looked up and waved her hand, or nodded, or smiled, or something." Cecily, meanwhile, was fumbling with the lock of the big old gate, which seemed, as on a former occasion, to give her a great deal of trouble. "Come!" cried Janet to Marcia. "We'll just about have time to catch her if we hurry." And seizing their hats, the girls hastened downstairs. Their front door closed behind them just as Cecily came abreast of them. What happened next was like a blow in the face. They had started forward, each with a friendly smile, expecting their new companion to meet them in a similar fashion. To their amazement, Cecily Marlowe, after the first sudden look into their faces, dropped her eyes and passed them by without a glance, precisely as if they were utter strangers to her. Both girls gasped, stared at her departing figure till she turned round the corner, and then into each other's faces. "The ungrateful little thing!" Marcia presently exploded. "If that wasn't the cut direct, I have never seen it before." "An unmistakable way of telling us to mind our own business," even Janet had to admit. "How humiliating! And yet—" "Yet what?" demanded Marcia indignantly. "You're surely not going to try to excuse such inexcusable conduct as that? I see very plainly what's happened. She thought it over and decided we were meddlesome, and just tried to push an acquaintance on her, and she thinks that she's a little too exclusive for that kind of thing, and the simple remedy was to cut us dead." Marcia was quite out of breath when she finished this summing up. "It does look like it," Janet admitted, "but somehow, even yet, I can't feel that she wanted to do it of her own accord, I mean." But Marcia couldn't see it in that light. They discussed the question hotly, still standing on the front step of the apartment. So long, in fact, did they argue it back and forth, turning and twisting the sorry little occurrence, viewing it in every possible light, that before they realized it, Cecily was returning, her errands accomplished. How she had managed to find her way and cross the streets in safety, they could only conjecture. To reach her own gate, she had to pass directly by where they were standing, and they saw her approaching down the block. "Here she comes," muttered Marcia. "Now let's stand right here and watch as she goes by. She can't help but see us. We'll give her one more chance to do the proper thing." And so they waited, breathless, expectant, while the girl came rapidly on, her eyes cast down, watching the pavement. But even when she was quite in front of them, she did not once look up, and without comment their gaze followed her retreating figure to the gate. As she fitted the big key and swung the gate open, they were just about to turn to each other in angry impatience when something else happened. Cecily Marlowe turned her head and looked back at them for one long, tense moment. It was such a wistful, imploring look, a gaze so full of appeal for forgiveness, so plainly in contrast with her recent conduct, that their hearts melted at once. Simultaneously they waved their hands and smiled at her, and she smiled back in return. the most adorable little smile in the world, full of trust and confidence and utter friendliness. Then she hurried in and closed the gate, leaving her two new friends outside, more bewildered than ever. End of Chapter 4. The Backward Glance. Chapter 5. The Handkerchief in the Window. The next day was spent by the two girls in an expedition to one of the nearby ocean beaches with Aunt Minerva. Under ordinary circumstances, it was a treat that would have delighted their hearts. But as matters stood, they only chafed with impatience to be back at their bedroom window, watching the house next door. The date for the trip, however, had been set some time before, and Aunt Minerva would have thought it very strange if they had begged off for such a flimsy reason as they could have offered. The day after found them again on the watch, though what they expected to see they couldn't have told. It was plain that, in spite of appearances, Cecily Marlowe's friendly feeling towards them was undiminished. The charming backward smile had indicated that unmistakably, but how to make it fit in with her refusal to signal and her forbidding conduct they could not understand, and the mystery kept them in a constant ferment of surmise. But even as they discussed it the next morning, their fancy work lying unheeded in their laps, they looked out suddenly with a simultaneous gasp of astonishment and delight. There was a tiny white handkerchief attached to the shutter in the upper window and fluttering in the breeze. "It's the signal, our signal!" cried Marcia. "Now what shall we do?"
Show that we have seen it by waving something?
"Here's my red silk scarf." "No," decided Janet.
Perhaps she'd rather not have us do anything that might attract attention.
"Let's go right down to the street, as we said we would, and see if she's there." They lost not a moment's time in reaching their front steps, but there was no sign of Cecily till they had come abreast of the Benedict gate. They discovered this ajar, and two blue eyes peering out of the narrow crack. As they came in sight there was a smothered exclamation.
"Oh, I'm so glad!"
The gate opened wider, and Cecily stood before them. "You are so good," she began at once in a low voice, stretching out both hands to them. "I was afraid you wouldn't come. I left the signal there, almost all day yesterday." "We were away!" cried Marcia promptly. "I am so sorry. We went Oh, then it's all right," breathed Cecily in relief. "I was sure you were angry at the way I acted."
It was on the tip of Marcia's tongue to demand why she had acted so, but she refrained,
and Cecily hurried on.
I just had to signal for you. We are in great trouble, and I don't know what to do."
"Oh, what is it?" cried both girls together. Miss Benedict is very ill," she continued hesitatingly. "She fell and hurt her ankle the other day, and it's been getting worse ever since. She's in bed, suffering great pain both yesterday and today. It's terribly swelled." "But why don't you send for the doctor?" interrupted Janet hastily. "She ought to have one if it's as bad as that." "I asked her that too yesterday, and she only said, 'No, no, I cannot. I must not have a doctor, child.' And when I asked what I could do for her, she answered, 'I don't know, I'm sure.' So there she lies, just suffering."
And I couldn't think of anything else to do, so I signaled you. You are my only friends in all this city."
There was something infinitely pathetic about the way she brought out this last statement.
It touched the hearts of both her listeners, and because of it they inwardly forgave her, once and for all,
for any action of hers that had offended them. And they had good sense not to comment on the strangeness of Miss Benedict's behavior. "Well, if she won't have a doctor, we must think of what else there is to be done," began Janet practically.
"I wish you would let me bring in
Aunt Minerva to see her," said Marcia. "She hurt her ankle just like that 2 years ago, and she'd know exactly what—" "Oh, no, no!" cried Cecily, starting forward. "Miss Benedict would not want that, does not want to see anyone. Please, please do not even mention to your aunt anything about her or me. Miss Benedict would not wish it." The request was certainly very peculiar, but the girls were able to conceal their surprise, great as it was. "Very well," said Marcia soothingly. "If you'd rather have it that way, we certainly won't speak of it. But I just had another idea. I remember Aunt Minerva had a certain kind of salve that she used for her ankle, and she kept it tightly bandaged on. It did her lots of good, cured her, in fact. Now, I believe I could get that salve at the drug store here." "Oh, could you?" exclaimed Cecily, in immense relief. "Let's go at once." "But you needn't trouble to go," said Marcia. "We won't be 10 minutes, and we'll come right back with it."
"I'd prefer to go,"
replied Cecily Marlowe, with such an air of quiet finality that neither dared to question it. All three started out after Cecily had locked the gate, and proceeded to the nearest drug store. Here Marcia made the purchase and paid for it from the change in her own handbag. But when they were outside the store, Cecily turned to her gravely. "I have a little English money of my own, but I did not like to offer in the shop. If you will tell me how much the salve cost in shillings, I will give it to you." And she held out several English shillings to Marcia. "Oh, you needn't do that. I'm glad to be able to think of something to do for Miss Benedict. It's such a little matter." "Please," reiterated Cecily. "I wish to tell her I bought it myself." "Why?" cried Marcia, and then the next moment wished she could recall the question that seemed to border on the personal. "Because I dare not tell her I have been talking to you," hesitated Cecily in an unusual burst of candor. And after that revelation they all walked back to the gate in an uneasy silence. When they stood again in the front of the blank barrier of the mysterious house, Cecily turned to Marcia. "I love your music," she said. "I always listen to it whenever you play. I knew you had been playing just for me these last few days, and I wanted to look out of my window and wave to you, but I must not. I am always there when you play, listening. I wanted you to know it." "Oh, I'm so glad!" cried Marcia delightedly. "I hoped it would please you. I'll play more than ever now. I'll do all my practicing there, too." "Cecily," said Janet abruptly, venturing on personal ground for the first time, "you are very lonely there, in that big house, with no other young folks, aren't you?" "Yes," answered Cecily, speaking very low, and glancing in an uncertain way at the gate. "Well, why don't you ask Miss Benedict if you couldn't run in and visit us once in a while, or go out for a walk with us sometimes? Surely she wouldn't object to that." "Oh, no, no!" cried Cecily hastily. Oh, how I would love to! But it wouldn't do. It wouldn't be allowed. No, I must not." There was nothing more to be said. "Well, at least, then," added Marcia, "you'll let us know if you need anything else. You'll signal to us?" "Yes," said Cecily. "I'll do that." She got out the key and unlocked the gate. Then she faced them with a sudden, passionate sob. "You are so wonderfully good to me. I love you both. You're all I have to care for." Then the gate was shut, and they heard her footsteps fleeing up the pathway. End of Chapter 5. The Handkerchief in the Window. Chapter 6. Cecily Reveals Herself. That night the two girls held a council of war. "It's perfectly plain to me," said Marcia, that poor little thing is right under Miss Benedict's thumb. I think the way she's treated is scandalous. Not allowed to go out, or speak to, or associate with anyone, and scared out of her wits all the time, evidently. What on earth is she there for, anyhow?" Janet scorned to reply to the old, unanswerable question. Instead, she remarked, "She's breaking her heart about it, too. I can see that. And, Marcia, wasn't it strange what she said just at the last, that she loved us, and that we were all that she had to care for? Where can all of her relatives and family be? Miss Benedict certainly can't be a relative, for Cecily calls her Miss. To think of that lovely little thing without a soul to care for her, except ourselves! Why, Marcia, it's amazing! But the main question now is what are we going to do about it? We must help her somehow." "I know what I'm going to do about it," replied Marcia decisively. "I'm going to tell Aunt Minerva about it, and see if she can't—" "Wait a minute," Janet reminded her. "You forget that Cecily fairly begged us not to mention anything about her to anyone." "That's so," said Marcia, looking blank. What are we going to do then? There's only one thing I can think of, answered Janet slowly. Miss Benedict may forbid Cecily to meet or speak to us, but she can't forbid us meeting and speaking to Cecily, can she? So why can't we just watch for Cecily to come out, then go and join her? She can't stop us. She can't help herself. And between you and me, I think she'll only be too delighted. Good enough, laughed Marcia. But what an ogre that Miss Benedict must be! I am horribly disappointed about her. After I heard her speak that time, I was sure she must be lovely. It doesn't seem possible that anyone with such a wonderful, sympathetic voice could be so downright hateful to a dear little thing like Cecily.
I must say it seems just horrid,
cried Janet vehemently. That night, after darkness had fallen, the two girls, settling themselves without a light at their open window, heard, as Marcia had once before described, the sound of running feet in the garden beyond the wall. This time there was no doubt in their minds about it. It was certainly Cecily taking a little exercise, probably on the deserted path. "I wonder why she runs," marveled Marcia. "I shouldn't feel like running around there all by myself." "I think I can understand, though," added Janet. "She's cooped up all day in that dreary old place, and probably has to keep awfully quiet. I'd go crazy if I were shut in like that. I feel like jumping hurdles when I got out of doors. And she's a country girl, too, remember. Get your violin, Marcia, and play something. I know it will comfort her to know we're nearby and thinking of her." So Marcia brought out her violin, and out into the darkness of the night floated the dreamy, tender melody of the Träumerei. The romance of the situation appealed to her, and she played it as she had never had before. At the first notes, the running footsteps ceased, and there was silence in the garden. When the music ended, they thought they could distinguish a soft little sound, half sigh, half sob, from the velvet blackness below, but they could not be sure. And a little later came the click of a closing door. Marcia put down her violin. "The lonely, lonely little thing!" she exclaimed, half under her breath. For 2 days thereafter they maintained a constant but fruitless vigil over Benedict's folly. Cecily did not appear either at her window or on a marketing expedition. Neither was there any sound of her footsteps in the garden at night. The girls began to worry. Could it be that Miss Benedict had discovered the truth about the remedy for her sprained ankle and had, perhaps, shut Cecily up in close confinement? Or even sent her away altogether? They were at this time at a loss as to just what to think of that mysterious lady. On the third afternoon, however, to their intense relief, they saw Cecily emerge from the house and walk towards the gate, with a market basket on her arm. It took them just about a minute and a half to reach the street. Cecily came abreast of their own doorstep in due time, her eyes cast down as usual. But they were waiting in the vestibule, and she did not see them. She was well in advance, but still in sight when they came down the steps and strolled in the same direction. It was not till they had turned the corner that they raced after her, and at last, breathless, caught up with her. "Oh!" she exclaimed, with a little start. "Why, I did not expect to see you today. You just mustn't come with me." In spite of her words, however, it was evident that she was really delighted by their unexpected appearance. "Look here, Cecily," began Marcia. "Why can't we join you when you go to market or are doing your errands?" "Oh, that would be lovely!" answered Cecily. "Only Miss Benedict usually asks me when I come in whether I have met or spoken to anyone, and I can't tell what isn't true." Here was a poser. The girls looked crestfallen. "No, you can't, of course," hesitated Janet. "And besides that," went on Cecily, "this is the last time I shall go, anyhow, because she is very much better now. The salve helped her ankle very much, and she says she is going out herself after this. I don't expect to get out again." There was a moment of horrified silence after this blow. Then Janet, no longer able to endure the bewilderment, burst out: "Cecily, dear, please forgive us if we seem to be prying into your affairs. It's only because we think so much of you. But who is Miss Benedict, and what is she to you?"
"I don't know,"
said Cecily slowly. "You don't know?" they gasped in chorus.
"No, I really don't. It must seem very strange to you, and it does to me. Miss Benedict is a perfect stranger to me, and no relation, so far as I know. I never saw or heard of her before I came here."
"But why are you here, then?" demanded Marcia.
"I don't know. It's all a mystery to me. But I'm so lonely I've cried myself to sleep many a night."
"Won't you tell us about it?" begged Marcia. "We're your friends, Cecily. You say the only ones you have, and we don't ask just out of curiosity, but because we're interested in you, and we love you."
"Well, I will then," agreed the girl as they walked along. "I'll just tell you how it all happened. Ever since I could remember anything, I've lived in Cranby, a little village in England. Mother and I lived there together. We never went anywhere, not even up to London, because she was never very strong. Father was dead. He died when I was a tiny baby, she told me. We just had a happy, quiet life together, we two. Well, about the beginning of this year, Mother was suddenly taken very, very ill. I don't know what was the matter, but I hardly had time to call in a neighbor and then bring the doctor."
Cecily paused and choked down a rising sob.
She just slipped away before we knew it,"
she went on, very low. Marcia pressed her hand in wordless sympathy. Presently Cecily continued.
"Afterward, the neighbor, Miss Waddington, told me that while I was fetching the doctor, Mother had begged her to see that, if she didn't recover, I should be taken over to New York and left with a family named Benedict. And she had Miss Waddington write down the address. But just then Mother grew so much worse that she couldn't explain why I was to be taken there, or what they were to me, or I to them. After it was all over, we searched everywhere, hoping to find some papers or letters or something that would tell. But we found nothing. So Mrs. Waddington kept me with her for 2 or 3 months. Then a friend of hers, a Mrs. Bidwell, was going to the States, and it was arranged that I should go in her care. About 2 weeks before we sailed, Mrs. Bidwell wrote to the Benedict family, saying that she was bringing me to New York. So we sailed from Liverpool, and the very day we landed, Mrs. Bidwell brought me here. We rang the old bell at the gate, and then waited and waited. We thought no one would ever come. But at last the gate opened, and Miss Benedict stood there, in her hat and veil. She acted very strangely from the first. Mrs. Bidwell told her all about me, and she never said a single word, but only shook her head several times. I thought she was certainly going to refuse to take me in, her manner was so odd. After she had stood thinking for a long time, she suddenly said to me, 'Come, then, and to Mrs. Bidwell I thank you.' And she led me inside, followed by the driver with my box, and shut the gate."
Cecily stopped short, as if that were the end of the story.
"Oh,
but go on!" stammered Marcia, quivering with impatience.
"But I must do my marketing now," said Cecily. "Here we are at the shop. I will tell you the rest when we come out."
End of Chapter 6. Cecily reveals herself. Chapter 7. Surprises all around. "How long have you been in New York?" began Janet, when they at last emerged from the little shop.
"About 2 months," said Cecily. "And I have lived in that place all this time, and have not known why. Miss Benedict has never explained. She acts towards me as if I were a lodger, or someone she has allowed to stay there for reasons of her own, but didn't particularly want to have about. She's kind to me, but never friendly. Sometimes she looks at me in the strangest way. I can't imagine what she's thinking about. But why does she live like this?"
And she turned inquiring eyes on the girls. "I'm sure we don't know!" exclaimed Marcia. "We only wonder about it. The house seems to be all shut up."
"Why, it is,"
Cecily enlightened them.
"And it makes it so dark and gloomy. There is lovely furniture in the drawing room, but it is all covered over with some brown stuff, even the pictures. And most of the other rooms are not used at all. Nothing on the ground floor. I eat down in the basement, and my bedroom is on the top floor, where I looked out that time. I have never been in any other bedrooms except Miss Benedict's when her ankle was bad."
"But what do you do with yourself all day?" asked Janet.
"I keep my room in order, and I help Miss Benedict whenever she lets me. Of course, she prepares all the food herself, but in such a pretty, dainty way. But there are a good many hours when the time hangs so heavy on my hands. Sometimes she lets me dust the rooms on the ground floor. She keeps everything very, very neat, even if it is all covered up and never used. The rest of the time I sit in my room and I read the few books I brought with me, and I tell myself long stories or listen to your music. I dare not now even to peep through the shutters. Once I opened them when you were playing, but Miss Benedict came in and forbade me to do it again."
"Doesn't she ever let you go out and take a walk or get a little exercise?" questioned Marcia.
"No, the only times I've gone out have been just lately, when her ankle has been so bad. At night, after it's dark, she lets me run about the garden a bit, but never in the daytime."
"But how did she find out about your knowing us?" broke in Janet.
"Why, of course I told her, that first time when you were so good to me, all about meeting you and how lovely you were to me. I thought she'd be so glad I'd found such nice friends, but she looked so queer, almost frightened, and she said, 'You must not speak to them again. It was kind of them to help you, but you must not encourage them in any way. Remember, child.' And I was only trying to obey her when I passed you without looking up the second time I went out."
"Cecily," said Marcia suddenly, "what does Miss Benedict look like, anyhow? Do you ever see her without that veil? Isn't she very old and plain?"
"Why, no," answered Cecily simply. "She's very beautiful."
"What?" they gasped in chorus.
"Yes, I was surprised, too, that day that I came. After the driver brought in my box into the hall, she wouldn't let him take it any further, and she shut the door behind him, and we were left all alone. She seemed to hesitate, but at last she raised her hands and took off her bonnet and veil. I don't know what I expected, but I was surprised to see such a lovely face. Her hair is gray, almost white, and so soft and wavy. And yet she has rosy cheeks and white teeth and the most big, beautiful gray eyes. And her voice is very sweet, too. Do you know, I believe if she'd only let me, I could just love her. But she holds me off as if she were somehow afraid of me. It's all very strange."
The girls were completely nonplussed by this latest bit of information, and found it hard to couple Cecily's attractive picture with the little black-robed and veiled figure that they knew as Miss Benedict. The voice alone tallied, and Marcia recounted how she had once met Miss Benedict in the little grocery shop. Suddenly, however, she was struck by a new thought and demanded, "But how about the other one?" Cecily opened her eyes wide.
"Other one?" she queried. "Oh, you mean the other person in the house?"
"Why, yes," said Marcia, "the other old lady who sits in the room on the second floor."
"Oh, is it an old lady?" inquired Cecily in surprise.
"Why, of course! Didn't you know it?" exclaimed Marcia.
"I knew there was someone in there, some invalid, for Miss Benedict has always warned me to be very quiet in going by that door, because someone was ill in there. But she never told me who it was, nor anything more about her. She always waits on herself. Even when her ankle was hurting her so, she would drag herself out of bed many times a day and go into that room. But tell me, how did you know that there was an old lady in there?"
Then Marcia recounted what she had seen on the night the wind tore open the shutter. "How strange this all is," she ended, "that Miss Benedict should never tell you who the person is. Why do you suppose she is keeping it a secret?" As this was a problem none of them could solve, they could only conjecture vainly about it as they walked along. But by this time they had approached within a block of the house itself, and before they turned the corner once more, they all unconsciously halted. "Cecily," said Marcia, suddenly inspired with a bright idea, "I have the grandest scheme. If Miss Benedict is going to do the marketing after this, Perhaps we won't see you again for some time. But I have a plan by which we can hear from each other as often as we like. You take a walk in the garden every night, don't you?"
"No, not always," answered Cecily. "Miss Benedict allows me to, but I often don't care to. It's so dark and lonesome."
"Well, after this be sure to go out every night. Our window, you know, is directly over the garden wall, only 3 stories up. I'm going to have a long string with a weight attached to it and fasten it to the window. Every night after dark we'll write a note to you, fasten it on the string, and drop it down into the garden among the bushes. You can find it in the dark by feeling for the string, and if you have one written to us, you can fasten it on and we'll pull it up. Isn't that a dandy idea?" Cecily's eyes sparkled for a moment, but suddenly her face clouded.
"Oh, it would be glorious!" she murmured. "Only I must not. Even if Miss Benedict doesn't know about it, I know she would forbid it if she did, so it would be wrong for me to do."
"Oh, Cecily, why should you care?" cried Marcia impatiently. "And why should she object to 3 girls sending little notes to one another? It would be cruel to forbid that. It isn't really wrong, you know."
"But she isn't cruel to me," Cecily interrupted. "You mustn't think that. Well, somehow, I feel she would be nice to me, only something is holding her back. She isn't a bit cruel. I sometimes feel as if I could care for her in spite of everything. So I don't want to go against her wishes."
"Well, then," began Janet, "here's a way out of it. We'll write to you, anyhow. Miss Benedict can't forbid us to do that. And you needn't answer at all. Needn't even read them, if you don't want to. But we'll write, nevertheless, and you can't prevent it." When Cecily smiled, her face lit up as if it was touched by a shaft of sunlight, and she smiled now.
"I don't believe I ought to read them," she said, "but oh, it would keep me from being so very lonely. But I must be going back now. I've been longer than usual. Good-bye."
Cecily was still smiling as she turned away, while Janet and Marcia stood looking after her, waving farewell to her as she rounded the corner. End of Chapter 7. Surprises all around. Chapter 8. At the End of the String. It was past midnight that night before the 2 girls could settle themselves for a wink of sleep. So bewildering had been Cecily's revelations about herself and Miss Benedict and the conditions in the mysterious house that they found inexhaustible food for discussion and conjecture. The most interesting question, of course, was the absorbing mystery of how Cecily came to be there at all. "Why should have her mother sent her there?" demanded Marcia for the 20th time. "Perhaps she was a relative," ventured Janet. "That's perfect nonsense," argued Marcia, "for then Miss Benedict would have surely acted quite differently. If she had been the most distant connection, Miss Benedict would have surely told her. No, I should say that she might be the child of a friend that Miss Benedict never cared particularly about, and yet she doesn't quite like to send her away. Isn't it a puzzle? But what do you think of Miss Benedict being beautiful? I can't imagine it. And then, too, think of Cecily's not knowing that there was another old lady in the house," added Janet. "What a darling Cecily is!" exclaimed Marcia irrelevantly. "If Miss Benedict knew how sweet and loyal and obedient Cecily is, she would be a little less strict with her, I'm sure. I suppose she doesn't want her to gossip about what goes on in the queer house. And, by the way, we must get our string in working order to-night. Let's send her other things besides notes, too, things she'd enjoy." And until they fell asleep, they planned the campaign for lighting the lonely hours of the girl next door. The next day they jointly wrote a long letter, telling all about themselves, their homes, their schools, their studies, and any other items they thought might interest her, fastened it to the end of the string, and dropped it into the dark garden after nightfall. Later they heard Cecily's light footsteps in the gloom below, and when they pulled up the string just before they went to bed, the note was gone. "Well, she's evidently decided that it would be all right for her to take it," said Janet, "and I'm relieved, even if she doesn't answer. I can see why she mightn't think it right to do that. And now we must plan to send her something besides, every once in a while.
I should think that she would just die of lonesomeness in that old place, and with hardly a thing to do, either." That night they sent her down a little box of fudge that they had made in the afternoon, and the next night a book that had captivated them both. And when they pulled up the string the evening after, there was the book again, and in it a tiny note, which ran: "Dear girls, you are too good to me. I ought not to be writing this. It is wrong, I fear. But I just cannot sleep until I have thanked you for the sweets and this beautiful book. I read it all to-day. You are making me very happy. I love you both. Cecily." Meantime they had seen Miss Benedict go in and out once or twice, limping slightly, and had watched her veiled figure with absorbed interest. Who could possibly imagine her as beautiful, they marveled. And truly it was an effort of imagination to connect beauty with the queer, oddly arrayed little figure. Also, at various times during each day, Marcia made a point of giving a little violin concert at her window, and, at Janet's suggestion, had chosen the liveliest and most cheerful music in her repertoire for sad little Cecily's entertainment. The two girls likewise exhausted every possibility in the line of small gifts and tiny trifles to amuse and entertain their young neighbor. But there was no farther communication from her till one night after they had set down an embroidery ring and silks, the latest pattern of a dainty boudoir cap, and elaborate instructions how to embroider it. The next night there was a note at the end of the string when they drew it up. It read: "How dear of you to send me this! I love to embroider, and had brought no materials with me. And now I want to ask you a question. Do you mind what I do with it after it is finished? Is it my very own? What can I ever do to repay you for all your kindness?" In their answer they assured her that she could make any use of the boudoir cap that pleased her, and then they spent much time wondering what use she was going to make of it. 2 nights later, when they pulled up the string, they found, to their surprise, a small parcel attached to the end. It contained a little box in which lay, wrapped in jeweler's cotton, a tiny coral pendant and an old-fashioned gold setting, and a silver bracelet of thin filigree work. The pendant was labeled, "For Marcia, with Cecily's love," and the bracelet, "For Janet, with love from Cecily." The two girls gazed at the pathetic little gifts, and sudden tears came into their eyes. "Oh, Jan!" half-sobbed Marcia. "We oughtn't keep them. They are probably the only trinkets she has." But Jan was wiser. "We must keep them," she decided. "Cecily doesn't want all the giving to be on one side, and she has probably been longing to do something for us. I suppose these are the only things that she had that would be suitable. Much as I hate to have her deprive herself of them, I know she would be terribly hurt if we sent them back. Tomorrow we must write her the best letter of thanks we can." So the days went by for 2 or 3 weeks. The girls caught, in all this time, not so much as one glimpse of Cecily, but they managed, thanks to their line of communication, to keep constantly in touch with her. Meanwhile, the summer weather waxed hotter and hotter, and the city fairly steamed under the July sun. Their own time was taken up by many diversions: trips to the parks, beaches, and zoo, excursions out of town with Aunt Minerva, shopping, and quiet sewing or reading in their pleasant living room. Every time they went out of their home on a pleasure jaunt, they felt guilty to think of the lonely little prisoner cooped up in the dreary house next door, and they both declared that they would gladly give up their places to her, had such a thing been possible. Then one night something unusual occurred. They sent down the usual note, and also a little work basket of Indian-woven sweetgrass, the souvenir of a recent trip to the seaside. To their astonishment, when they drew up the string, both the note and the basket were still attached. It was the first time such a thing had happened. "What can be the matter?" queried Marcia. "Can it be possible that Cecily feels that she mustn't do this any more?" "I didn't hear any footsteps down there to-night. Did you?" said Janet. "No, come to think of it, I didn't. She must have stayed indoors for the first time since we began this. But what do you suppose is the reason?" Janet suddenly clutched her friend.
Marcia, can it be possible that Miss Benedict has discovered what we've been doing and won't let her come out any more?" "I believe that's it." Marcia's voice was sharp with consternation. "Wouldn't it be dreadful if it's so?" They sat gloomily thinking it over. "Well, what are we going to do about it?" demanded Marcia. "Wait till to-morrow night and try again," counseled Janet. "It's just possible Cecily had a headache, or felt sick from this abominable heat, and couldn't come down. Let's see what happens to-morrow." The next night they tied the basket and another note to the string and dropped it down hopefully, but they drew it up untouched, precisely the same as before. "It's just one of two things," decided Marcia. "Either Cecily is ill, or Miss Benedict has found out about our little plan and forbidden Cecily to go on with it. What are we to do? Keep on sending notes, or stop it? Suppose Miss Benedict herself should find one sometime?" "I don't care!" cried Janet decisively. "If Cecily is ill, she'll get better pretty soon and come out some night, and there'll be nothing for her. She'll be dreadfully disappointed. I don't care if there is the possibility that Miss Benedict knows all about it. I'm going to keep right on writing and take the chance." For a whole week they followed their usual program, nightly sending down a fresh note that they always later drew up, unclaimed. And as the days passed they became more and more alarmed. Something had certainly happened to Cecily. Of that they were sure, and their misgivings grew more keen with the passing time. "Can it be that she isn't there any more?" conjectured Marcia suddenly one day. "Perhaps Miss Benedict has sent her away." This was a new and startling possibility. The more they contemplated it, the more depressed they grew. If that was the case, then they might never see Cecily again, and the delightful and curious friendship would be ended forever. Their usual good spirits were quite subdued, and even their hearty appetites suffered somewhat, which worried Aunt Minerva not a little, though she attributed it to the heat. Finally, one night, precisely 1 week after the first unclaimed communication, they sent down the usual letter, begging Cecily, if possible, to let them know what was the matter. It seemed to both, during the interval that they left it there, that they heard light, almost stealthy footsteps in the garden below, but neither felt certain about it. An hour later they drew up the string. Their own note was still attached to it at the bottom, but just above they saw fastened a little scrap of paper, no bigger than a quarter of an ordinary note sheet. Both girls started with delight. "Quick!" cried Marcia. "Cecily has answered at last. Oh, I'm so glad!" Janet unfastened it, her fingers trembling with excitement, and spread it out on the table. It was not Cecily's handwriting, and contained but a few words. Both girls read it at a glance, and then stared into each other's eyes, half terror-stricken, half amazed. For this is what it said: "Will you please come to the gate tomorrow morning at 9:30? A. Benedict." End of Chapter 8. At the End of the String. Chapter 9. For the Sake of Cecily. "What can it mean?" muttered Janet. "What does she want of us?" "Why, it's perfectly plain," declared Marcia. "She has discovered that we have been trying to correspond with Cecily, and she's going to demand an explanation. Probably warn us that we must stop it. Are you afraid to go, Janet?" "Not I! Why should I be? Miss Benedict can't do or say a thing to harm us, but I am anxious for poor little Cecily. I just hate to think that we may have brought trouble on her." "Oh, I wish now we'd never suggested such a thing," moaned Marcia. "We've just succeeded in making that poor little thing miserable, I suppose." "Well, we can only remember that we meant to make her happy, and we did, for a while at least," comforted Janet. "And what's more, I'm not going to worry about it another bit to-night. Maybe it's something entirely different, anyway." Marcia, however, could not bring herself to this cheerful view of things. All night long she tossed beside the sleeping Janet, wondering and wondering about what the coming interview might mean, and blaming herself 1,000 times for placing Cecily in a position of having deceived her guardian. When morning came she was pale and heavy-eyed, which alarmed her aunt not a little. "You ought not to go out this morning, Marcia," remarked Miss Minerva, anxiously. "The sun is very hot, and you look as if you had a headache." "Oh, no, I haven't, Auntie," cried Marcia, eagerly, fearful of a hitch in their plans. "I didn't sleep very well. but a walk in the fresh air will do me good, I know." And so Miss Minerva saw them go, without further protest. Both girls halted at the gate in the brick wall and looked into each other's eyes. The hot morning sun beat down upon them as they stood there, and passers-by eyed them curiously. Each was perfectly certain that the thumping of her heart could be heard, and still they stood, hesitating. "You're afraid," accused Janet. "I'm not," protested Marcia, "and I'll prove it." She raised her hand suddenly and pulled the rusty bell handle. It seemed a long, long time before there was any response, but at last they heard the click of the opening front door and the sound of footsteps on the path. This was followed by the creaking of a key turning in the lock of the gate. Janet gripped Marcia by the hand, and with pounding hearts they stood together while the gate slowly opened. In another instant the veiled black-gowned figure of Miss Benedict stood before them. She waited a moment, silent, appearing to look them over critically. "Come in, if you please," she said at last, very softly, and held the gate open for them. They entered obediently, and she shut the gate. It was not until they were inside the house, standing in the dim hall with the front door closed behind them, that another word was spoken. Then Miss Benedict faced them again, but she did not remove her bonnet or throw back her veil. "I have asked you to come here this morning," she began, "because I understand that you have become acquainted with the child Cecily Marlowe." Cold chills ran up and down their spines. It had come at last. "Yes," faltered Janet. We have become acquainted with her." It was not a brilliant reply, but for the life of her she could think of nothing else to say. They waited shuddering for what might be coming next. "So she has told me," went on Miss Benedict. "I also understand that lately you have been dropping notes to her into the garden at night." Janet noticed, even in the midst of her trepidation, how wonderfully sweet and soft and harmonious the voice was. "Yes," replied Marcia, very low, "we have." The worst was out. Now let the blow fall. They braced themselves to receive it. "Cecily is ill," said Miss Benedict abruptly. They each uttered a startled little "Oh!" "She has not been at all well for over a week," the lovely voice continued. "I am very much worried about her." Janet and Marcia glanced into each other's eyes in astonishment. Cecily ill, and Miss Benedict actually caring about it! Here were surprises indeed! "Oh, I hope it's nothing serious!" exclaimed Marcia anxiously. "I hope it is not, and I think it is probably only the hot weather and want of exercise." Miss Benedict hesitated a little over the last. "She has been so poorly and has evidently been so anxious to see you, that I thought I would surprise her by asking you to come and visit her a while." It was plainly a struggle for Miss Benedict to make this seem the natural, normal thing to do. "Will you come up to her room?" The girls were almost too stunned at the turn events had taken to reply. "Why, we'd be glad to," faltered Marcia at last. "Then, if you will follow me." Miss Benedict led the way through the dark halls and up 3 pairs of stairs. At the door of the room on the 4th floor she paused, knocking, then entered. They followed, dimly perceiving a little form in the bed, for the shutters, of course, were closed. As they entered after Miss Benedict, Cecily sprang to a sitting posture with a cry of mingled wonder, consternation, and joy. She, too, glanced uncertainly at Miss Benedict. "I have asked your friends to come and see you for a while," she explained hesitatingly to the bewildered child. "Perhaps it will make you feel better." Then she turned abruptly and went out of the room, closing the door after her. For a moment they stared at one another. "Cecily!" cried Janet at length. "What does this all mean, anyway? I never dreamed of such a thing as seeing you here," faltered the invalid. "What made her do it?" demanded Marcia. "We found a note from her tied to our string. How did she know about it?" Cecily seemed to shrink back at this piece of news.
I told her myself, she said. I was very sick one night, and I think I had a fever. My head was so hot and ached so. And she was, oh, so good to me. I could hardly believe it. She bathed my head and sat by me and put her cool hands on my forehead. It really seemed as if she cared. And I felt so ashamed to think I'd disobeyed her that I told her right out all about it. How lonely I had been, and how good you were to me, and how I enjoyed hearing from you. And what did she say? Breathed Marcia in an awestruck whisper. Not a word except, never mind now, little girl. And she never said a thing more about it. I didn't dream that she would ever do such a thing as send for you to come and see me. They marveled over it all a moment in silence. Then Marcia burst out, Oh, Cecily, we have been so worried about you. We couldn't think of why you didn't even take the letters any more. Have you been very ill? Why, I don't know. I just feel horrid most of the time. My head aches a lot, and every once in a while I'm awfully cold, and then I seem to be burning up.
Why, I believe you must have malaria, interrupted Marcia. That's what Aunt Minerva has sometimes. You ought to go out more and have fresh air and sunshine. She stopped suddenly, remembering the conditions. But anyway, it isn't serious, she hurried on after an embarrassed pause. And you ought to have some quinine. I wonder if Miss Benedict would let us get it for you. I'll ask her later. Then they hurried on to tell her how they had continued to send down a note every night, hoping that she would get it, and how they feared that she might have gone away. And Cecily, in return, told them how she had enjoyed the notes and gifts, but how guilty she had always felt about receiving them, especially when she had answered them.
And I finished embroidering the boudoir cap, she ended, and I gave it to Miss Benedict.
You did? They both gasped.
Oh, I hope you don't mind, exclaimed Cecily hastily. But I felt if I wanted to do something for her. I think that I'm getting to like her more and more.
What did she say? Asked Marcia. Was she pleased? I can't imagine her wearing such a thing.
She looked at it and then at me very strangely for a minute. Then she said, Thank you, child. I never wear such things, but I will keep it, for your sake.
Isn't that queer? Exclaimed Janet. I thought she cared nothing about you.
Yes, agreed Cecily, but lately I'm not so sure.
In the pause that followed, the girls glanced curiously about the darkened room, trying to realize that they were actually inside the mysterious house at last. It was a large, square room, furnished with heavy chairs and an old-fashioned bureau and bed. Every shutter was fastened and the slats tightly closed. Only the dimmest daylight filtered in. The effect was gloomy and depressing to the last degree. They wondered how Cecily had stood it so long. I'm going to ask Miss Benedict if we can't open these shutters, cried Janet suddenly. I should think you'd die of this gloom. It's really bad for you, Cecily.
Oh, don't! Exclaimed Cecily in consternation. I asked her once when I first came, and she didn't like it at all. She said no, she preferred to have them shut, and I must not touch them.
I don't care, went on Janet ruthlessly. You weren't sick then. I'm sure she'd let you now. And true to her word, she turned to Miss Benedict, who entered at this moment, still bonneted and veiled. I believe Cecily has malaria, Miss Benedict, she began bravely, but with inward trepidation.
Oh, do you think so? Is it serious?
The melodious voice sounded startled and concerned. I don't think it's so serious, Janet continued, but she would probably get over it quicker if she had lots of fresh air and sunshine. Couldn't she have the shutters open? It would do her lots of good. Cecily and Marcia trembled at Janet's temerity and watched Miss Benedict with bated breath. But instead of being annoyed, she only seemed surprised and relieved.
Why, do you think so? She queried. Then surely they may be opened. I do not like the glare of so much daylight myself, but Cecily may have it here, if she chooses.
And following up her words, she pushed open one of the shutters. A broad shaft of sunlight streamed in, and blinking from the previous gloom, Janet and Marcia threw open the others. Cecily gave a delighted cry.
Oh, How lovely it is to see the sun again!" But Miss Benedict, with an abrupt exclamation, retreated hastily from the room. The girls stayed a few minutes more chatting, and then wisely suggested that perhaps they had better go, and not tire Cecily by too long a call. Hearing Miss Benedict's footsteps in the hall below, they took their leave, promising to come again as soon as it seemed best. On the landing of the stairway they found the black-veiled figure apparently waiting for them. Now, during all of the strange little interview, a curious impression had been growing upon Janet, strengthened by every word Miss Benedict had uttered, an impression that there was no grim, forbidding jailer, such as they had imagined the mistress of Benedict's Folly to be. Instead, they had encountered a gentle, almost winning little person, worried about the illness of the child in her care, and plainly anxious to do everything suggested to make her more comfortable. Janet suddenly resolved on a bold move. "Cecily is so lonely," she began, turning to Miss Benedict. "Don't you think it would do her lots of good to come in and visit us once in a while? Marcia's aunt would be so glad to see her. As soon as she is a little better, can't she—" "No!" interrupted Miss Benedict, her little figure suddenly stiffening and a determined note creeping into her soft voice. "I am sorry Cecily cannot make visits. It is out of the question." It was like striking a hidden rock in a smooth, beautiful sheet of water. And her words admitted no argument. Janet and Marcia followed her meekly and in silence down to the front door. Here, in an uncertain pause, Marcia made one further suggestion. "May we bring Cecily some quinine?" she ventured. "If she has malaria, she ought to have that. We have lots of it at home." "That would be very kind of you," replied Miss Benedict, in an entirely different tone. "Come to-morrow and see her again, if your aunt will permit it. Perhaps it would be well to explain to her," and here her manner became confused, "that I don't make calls or receive them. But this is just for the sake of the child." It was plain to the girls that this admission was wrung from her only by great effort. She opened the front door and followed them to the gate. When she had unlocked it, Marcia turned to her impulsively. "Thank you so much for letting us come. We are very, very fond of Cecily. She is such a dear, and we have been terribly worried about her. As a relative, I'm afraid you have been still more anxious." The black figure started. "She is no relative of mine," came abruptly behind the veil. "Oh, I beg your pardon. I should say friend," stuttered Marcia, embarrassed. Or the daughter of a friend, perhaps." "She is not," Miss Benedict contradicted in a strange, flat tone, as if repeating a lesson. "I do not know who she is, nor why she is here." End of Chapter 9. For the Sake of Cecily. Chapter 10. The Filigree Bracelet. Aunt Minerva took off her silver-rimmed spectacles, wiped them excitedly, and put them on again. "And you say she didn't know who the child was or why she was there? Well, I never!" she exclaimed, adjusting them all awry. Marcia had decided to tell her aunt all about it, and Janet had agreed with her that since Miss Benedict had spoken as she did, there could be no further occasion for secrecy. So that night they gave her the entire history of the affair and found her a willing listener, interested and sympathetic beyond their wildest expectations. "Why, Auntie, I didn't suppose you cared much about it!" exclaimed Marcia in surprise. "And here you are, nearly as excited over it as we have been!" "Why, who wouldn't be?" said Miss Minerva. "It's precisely like a mystery in a book. I wasn't interested in that old place at first because I was too busy, and it seemed as if the people living there were such slack housekeepers. I haven't any sympathy with that. But what could she mean by that last remark? Not know who the child is, or why she's there? It's absurd! I can't believe it!" "Well, that's what she said," asserted Marcia again. "And if anyone ever heard a bigger mystery, I'd like to know about it." Miss Minerva took up her mending again. "Then I don't see why she keeps the girl," she commented. "She keeps her, I think, because she's getting sort of fond of her," reasoned Janet. "You can easily see that. Cecily said that she was very good to her on the night that she was so ill. And then, too, it must have been a hard pull for her to go so far as to send for us to come in just because it might please Cecily."
We must see that that child has the quinine, and it wouldn't hurt her to have a glass or two of currant jelly. Don't forget them when you go in tomorrow," Miss Minerva reminded them. "I like to have her here and nurse her myself and feed her up a bit. And that's another strange thing. Why should that woman" Miss Minerva invariably alluded to Miss Benedict as "that woman" "allow you to go in and visit the child, yet forbid her to visit you?" "Don't ask us why," laughed Marcia. "We're as much in the dark as any one else. What I want to know is why Miss Benedict allowed Cecily to open her shutters today when she refused her a while ago. And why doesn't she open them over all the rest of the house?" "Well, what I want to know," added Janet, "is why Cecily's mother should have sent her over here to the Benedicts at all, when nobody knew her or claimed her. Whatever made her think of such a thing?" "There are several explanations that might suit the case," mused Miss Minerva. "Miss Marlowe might have been a married sister, or some distant relative who" "Then wouldn't Miss Benedict know about it, or at least suspect some connection?" interrupted Marcia. "That's true," acknowledged her aunt. "There must be some other explanation. What a puzzle!" "What's more," added Janet, "I remember that Cecily told us this. When she first came, Miss Benedict questioned her all about herself, where she came from, and all that. And after Cecily had told her, she never said a word, just walked away, shaking her head." Miss Minerva's mind suddenly took a new turn. "Didn't you say the child sent you a couple of gifts, little trinkets, not long ago? I'd like to see them." "We've never worn them," said Marcia. "It just seemed as if we couldn't. She ought not to have given them away. And yet, I know just how she felt. She wanted to do something. I'll get them." She brought the box and laid it in her aunt's lap. Miss Minerva examined the coral pendant first. "The little dear thing!" she murmured. "She must think a lot of you to have parted with this." Then she laid it down and took up the bracelet. "Gracious!" she exclaimed immediately, letting it fall and then picking it up again. "Am I going crazy, or are my eyes deceiving me?" She turned it over and over. "What's the matter?" cried both girls at once. "Matter?" cried Miss Minerva. "Why, just this. That bracelet is exactly like one I had put away for years." The girls stared at her incredulously. "I'll get it this minute and prove it," and she hurried out of the room. While she was gone, they examined the bracelet more closely than they had done yet. It consisted of two thin rims of silver, joined by silver filigree work, a quarter of an inch wide. Here and there, at intervals in the filigree, and forming part of the pattern, were several strange characters, looking, as Marcia declared, like those on the receipt from the Chinese laundry. The workmanship was unusually delicate and beautiful. In 5 minutes Miss Minerva was back, flushed and disheveled, from a hunt through several bureau drawers and boxes. "I couldn't find it at first," she panted. "In Northam I used to be able to lay my hand on anything I wanted, at an instant's notice. But in this apartment" she heaved a resigned sigh and laid something beside the bracelet on the table. It was the exact duplicate in every last detail. Even the complicated characters were identical. The three stared at the trinkets in expressive silence. Not for a moment could it be doubted that these two bracelets were once a pair. They were so unusual that it was impossible that there could be others like them. This astonishing fact was patent to them all. "Aunt Minerva, where did you get yours?" breathed Marcia at last. "Well, that's easily explained," answered Miss Brett. "Your father brought it to me about 10 or 12 years ago, after one of his voyages. He said that a Chinese sailor in Hong Kong had offered to sell it to him for a small sum, and, seeing it was a rather unique little trinket, he bought it and brought it home to me. I never wear such things, however. Jewelry never did appeal to me, and bracelets particularly always seemed a nuisance. So I put it away, intending to give it to you some day, Marcia. And after a while I actually forgot all about it, till tonight." Janet sat up very straight. "There's just one thing I'd give my head to know this minute. Where did Cecily get her bracelet?" "Well, that you can easily find out, but I'm afraid you'll have to wait until tomorrow morning," laughed Marcia. "There's something very strange about this," marveled Miss Minerva, turning the two trinkets over and over. Actually, I can hardly tell now which one is mine and which hers, except that mine is a little more tarnished from having been laid away. Your father said when he gave me mine that he had never seen anything like it in any of those foreign jewelry shops, and that's why he had been specially attracted to it." "Auntie," asked Marcia suddenly, "where do you suppose that sailor got it?" "Your father said," replied Miss Minerva, "that he'd probably stolen it, or someone else had. It may have passed through dozens of hands after it was taken from the original owner. You can never tell about such things in the East, and it is useless to inquire." Again they all stared hard at the two silver trinkets lying side by side on the table. "And these two bracelets once belonged to the same person," murmured Marcia at last. "Perhaps to some one connected with Cecily. And to think that they should have drifted halfway around the world to find themselves side by side again in busy, practical New York!" Chapter 11. The Filigree Bracelet. Chapter 11. The Lifted Veil. Next morning, Marcia and Janet sallied forth to make their promised visit to Cecily. They were armed with a box of quinine pills, 2 glasses of currant jelly, a new magazine, Marcia's violin in its case, and last but not least, the 2 filigree bracelets. And they were literally bursting with news and excitement. Miss Benedict opened the gate for them as before, and to their inquiries replied that Cecily seemed a little better. If she noticed the suppressed excitement in their manner, she did not comment upon it, but only led the way to Cecily's room without further words. She was bonneted and veiled as usual. At the door she left them, saying that she would not go in. "Cecily, Cecily!" cried Marcia immediately. "We have news! Such strange news for you!" Cecily was all at once eagerness and animation.
"Oh, tell me quickly!" she exclaimed, sitting up in the bed. "I feel so much better, and I'm going to get up today. But how can you have any news about me?"
"Cecily," said Janet, sitting down on the edge of the bed, "have you been thinking all this time that Miss Benedict knew everything about you and why you came here and all of that?"
"Why, of course!" cried Cecily, opening her eyes wide. "She has never explained it to me, and she's so queer that I never like to ask her. But I always thought she knew."
"Well, she doesn't. Not a thing, apparently," replied Janet, and then repeated to her all the strange conversation at the gate on the day before. When she had finished, Cecily sat as if stunned, quiet and rigid and staring out of the window. So much had it appeared to affect her that Janet was suddenly sorry she had said a word about it.
"Then what does it all mean?" murmured Cecily at last. "I'm here when I have no right to be. Nobody knows me or wants me. How did it all happen? Don't I belong to anybody?"
She looked so bewildered, so frightened, so unhappy, that Janet and Marcia both put their arms about her. "It's all right, Cecily. It's sure to be all right in the end. We would love you and want you if nobody else did. And I'm sure Miss Benedict must care for you, too. She really acts so. But the question is, how did you ever come to be sent here at all? Didn't your mother ever say anything to you about this place or any of the people over here?"
"No,"
said Cecily in a hushed voice. It was evident from her manner that the grief over the loss of her mother was very keen, and she had only once voluntarily referred to it or anything connected with it.
"My mother never, never mentioned the name of Benedict to me. I never heard it before."
"But couldn't Miss Benedict possibly have been some connection, some distant connection that she never thought of or mentioned?" persisted Marcia.
"No, my mother's people were all English," declared Cecily, "and they were all dead. We had no relatives living."
"Well, your father, then," supplemented Janet. "What about him?"
"I never knew him to remember him. Mother said he died when I was a baby, a year or 2 old. He hadn't any relatives either."
"Well, here's something else we have to tell you, and it's the strangest thing yet," began Janet.
"Can you tell us where you got that bracelet, Cecily? The one that you were so lovely as to send to us?" "Why, I've always had it," answered Cecily, "even when I was a tiny little girl, and it was much too big for me. It seemed to be mine. Mother kept it in a box, but she let me play with it once in a while. Then, when I was older and it fitted me better, she let me wear it. I think she said my father gave it to me, but I don't remember very clearly. I don't believe I ever thought much about it, although I realize it was rather unusual. But why do you ask?"
"Did she ever say that it had a mate? That there was a pair of them?"
questioned Marcia. "Oh, no, I am sure she never said anything about another."
"What do you think of this, then?" Marcia drew the two bracelets out of her bag and laid them side by side on the bed.
"Why, how very, very queer!" cried Cecily incredulously. "Where did you get the other?"
Marcia outlined its history. "You see, there isn't a shadow of a doubt that there was once a pair of them," she ended, "and that they both belonged to the same person. Now, who could that person be?" "It must have been some one connected with you, Cecily," added Janet. "Everything points that way. Well, one thing is certain. If we could find out the truth about these two bracelets, I believe we'd find out about Cecily, too. Why she is here and the whole mystery." All three were very silent for a moment, considering. "I know one thing," ventured Marcia at length. "Cecily, you must not give this bracelet away. It was dear and sweet of you to think of it in the first place, and we'll keep the little coral pendant for both of us if you like. But the bracelet is something that may mean a great deal to you yet, and you ought to have it. Don't you agree with me, Janet?" "I certainly do," added Janet heartily. "And what's more, I've thought of something else. When Captain Brett comes home next time, he may be able to tell us something more about the other bracelet. When do you expect him, Marcia?" "Not for 2 or 3 months," replied Marcia, ruefully. "I'd give anything if it only could be sooner. It seems as if we never could wait that long." "Well, let's not think of it just now," comforted Janet. "I don't suppose that we can find out anything until he does come, so there's no use fretting. How would you like to hear some music, Cecily? Marcia's brought her violin."
"How good of you!"
cried Cecily, an almost pathetic eagerness in her voice.
"It will be wonderful to hear it near by."
So Marcia opened the case, took out the instrument, tuned it, tucked it lovingly under her chin, and slipped into a rollicking Hungarian dance by Brahms, while her little audience listened spellbound.
"Oh, something else, please!"
cried Cecily, blissfully, when it was ended. And Marcia, changing the theme, gave them the lullaby from Jocelyn, and after that Beethoven's Minuet in G.
"Just one more?"
begged Cecily.
"That is, if you're not too tired. The one I like so much."
"I know, the Träumerei," nodded Marcia, and once more laid her bow across the strings. When the last note had died away, they were all suddenly startled by a strange sound just outside the door, a sound that was partly a sob and partly a half-stifled exclamation. Before she quite realized what she was doing, Janet, who happened to be sitting near the door, sprang up and threw it open. In the hall outside stood Miss Benedict, her hands clasped tensely in front of her. But strangest of all, her veil was thrown back from her face, and in the sudden light of the open door she stood revealed. In an instant they realized that Cecily had not exaggerated the beauty of her singularly lovely face. She plainly had been listening, captivated, to the music within the room, and something about it must have stirred her strangely. All of this they noticed in a fraction of a moment, for, as she saw them, she pulled down her veil with a hasty movement, murmuring something about having heard music and coming to see what it was. But she did not pull it down quickly enough to hide one fact from the gaze of the two girls, that her beautiful gray eyes were brimming with tears. End of Chapter 11. The Lifted Veil.